The night was supposed to be peaceful. A pregnant woman, just trying to make it home, never expected that a simple traffic stop would turn into a nightmare. But when the officer walked up to her car, his tone was aggressive from the start. She remained calm, her hands visible, answering his questions, but nothing seemed to satisfy him. Then, without warning, his anger exploded. What happened next left bystanders frozen in shock. But this woman wasn't just anyone. Her husband was a sheriff, and he was only seconds away. The moment he arrived, the entire situation took a drastic turn. The officer who thought he had all the power suddenly found himself facing someone who wouldn't back down. What did the sheriff do? And what happened to the cop who crossed the line? Stay tuned, because this story is about to take an unexpected turn. The sheriff stepped out of his vehicle, his heart pounding as he took in the scene. His wife stood frozen, one hand on her stomach, the other gripping the car door. The officer loomed over her, his face tense, his hand hovering near his belt. The air was thick with tension, and for a brief moment, no one moved. The sheriff's voice was calm but firm. "What's going on here?" he demanded, stepping closer. The officer turned, his expression shifting from anger to something else, realization. He had no idea who he had just confronted. Bystanders whispered, some recording on their phones. The pregnant woman's breath was shaky, but she locked eyes with her husband, knowing he would handle this. But the real question remained: would the officer back down, or would he try to justify his actions? The sheriff had seen injustice before, but this time it was personal. The officer stiffened, his grip tightening on his belt as he squared his shoulders. "Step back, sir. This is a traffic stop," he said, his voice laced with authority. But the sheriff didn't move. He wasn't just another bystander. This was his wife, and he needed answers. "She's pregnant," the sheriff stated, his voice controlled but firm. "What reason did you have to treat her like this?" His wife's hands trembled slightly, but she kept her chin up, refusing to show fear. The officer hesitated. His eyes darted to the growing crowd, phones still pointed at him. He had been in control just moments ago, but now the situation was shifting fast. "I need her to step out of the vehicle," the officer finally said. The sheriff narrowed his eyes, not without a reason. Silence hung between them. The officer had a choice to make: double down or back off. But the damage was already done. The sheriff took a step closer, his presence undeniable. The officer's jaw tightened as he glanced around, realizing the crowd was growing. People whispered, the tension thick in the air. The pregnant woman shifted uncomfortably, one hand still on her stomach, her breath uneven. "You need to step out of the vehicle," the officer repeated, his voice sharper this time. The sheriff shook his head. "Not until you explain why you escalated this situation in the first place." His voice was low, controlled, but there was no mistaking the warning in his tone. The officer's fingers twitched at his side, his frustration evident. She refused to comply. "I followed every command." The woman finally spoke, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "You kept pushing. Why?" The officer didn't answer. He was trapped between his authority and the undeniable reality of the moment. And then suddenly, backup arrived, flashing lights cutting through the night. But whose side were they on? The flashing lights painted the street in red and blue as more officers stepped out of their vehicles. The sheriff's grip tightened at his sides. His wife remained still, her pulse racing as she watched the scene unfold. A commanding voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" Another officer approached, his gaze shifting between the sheriff, his wife, and the cop who had started it all. Before the sheriff could respond, the first officer spoke up. She was resisting. His voice was firm, but there was an edge to it now, as if he knew his words wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. The sheriff's eyes darkened. "That's a lie." His voice was steady, but his patience was gone. Then something unexpected happened. One of the newly arrived officers stepped forward, looking directly at the sheriff's wife. "Ma'am, are you okay?" The first officer's face paled. He knew then this wasn't going his way anymore, but he wasn't finished yet. The moment hung heavy in the air. The sheriff's wife, still shaken, nodded at the officer who had asked if she was okay. "I just want to go home," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of everything that had happened. The officer turned toward the first cop, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said firmly. The first officer's face tightened. "I was doing my job." "Your job?" the sheriff shot back. "Is your job to intimidate pregnant women?" His voice was sharp now, his patience gone. The new officer didn't hesitate. "Turn over your body cam footage." The first cop stiffened, his eyes flickering with something close to panic. Then came the twist no one saw coming. A bystander, who had been silently recording, suddenly spoke up. "He turned it off," they said, holding up their phone. The video on the screen told the truth. The officer had nowhere left to hide. Silence fell over the scene as all eyes locked onto the phone's screen. The footage was clear. There was no justification for what had happened. The sheriff took a slow breath, his fists unclenching. His wife exhaled shakily, relief washing over her, but the weight of the moment still hung heavy. The officer who had demanded answers turned back to the first cop. "Hand over your badge," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The disgraced officer hesitated, but he knew it was over. With a clenched jaw, he unhooked his badge, setting it in the other officer's hand. He didn't say a word as he turned and walked away. The sheriff reached for his wife's hand, squeezing it gently. "Let's go home." As they drove away, the weight of the night lingered. Justice had been served, but the fight wasn't over. Not for them, not for anyone.